Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going back in time a bit. Well, in terms of our source material, at least. Haha, we're diving into some classic military theory with Carl von Clausewitz's On War.
Oh, class.
Definitely a classic. And it's always fascinating to see how these older texts still hold up in the modern world. For this deep dive, we're going to be unpacking Chapter 14 of Book 4, where Clausewitz really gets into the nitty-gritty of night combat.
Yeah, it's funny how even back in the early 1800s when Clausewitz was writing, there was this almost romantic vision of what it meant to fight at night.
I can see that. It has a certain allure, right? The darkness, the element of surprise, catching the enemy totally unaware. Like, it plays into our sense of adventure, I think.
Exactly. And Clausewitz himself acknowledges that initial appeal, that instinctive draw towards a well-executed night attack.
Sure, it sounds great in theory.
But, and this is crucial, he's also quick to point out that this often romanticized view usually comes from people who haven't actually experienced the realities of fighting in the dark. People who, shall we say, have maybe spent more time reading about battles than being in them.
So he's trying to bridge that gap
Yeah.
between the perceived advantage of darkness and the often overlooked complexities that come with it.
Precisely. He wants to equip us with a more, let's say, sober and clear-headed understanding of both the advantages and the limitations that come into play when you move a conflict into the cloak of night.
Okay, so let's get into those complexities. What are some of the challenges that Clausewitz highlights? What makes night combat so tricky?
Well, one of the biggest ones, and this honestly transcends centuries of warfare, is the issue of reliable intelligence. Even with the best scouts, the most advanced reconnaissance, the picture you have of the enemy's positions and movements at night, it's always going to be incomplete. At best, you're working with a puzzle with missing pieces.
And you could argue that that problem, if anything, is even more amplified in modern warfare, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. See, back in Clausewitz's time, armies were often more condensed, their formations more clearly defined. You might be able to get a decent sense of their disposition, even in the dark, just by the layout of their camps, the way their fires were positioned, things like that.
Right, like a sort of unintentional silhouette against the night sky.
Exactly. But today, with modern militaries spread out over much larger areas, using terrain for concealment, often employing camouflage and deception tactics, man, it's a whole different ballgame. That clear picture Clausewitz might have relied on, it just doesn't exist anymore.
It's easy to imagine how disorienting that would be for a soldier. You train to recognize enemy positions, anticipate their movements, but then darkness descends and suddenly all those carefully honed instincts are thrown for a loop.
Exactly. And that lack of clear visual information, it feeds into another challenge that Clausewitz brings up, the increased difficulty and danger of distinguishing friend from foe.
Oh, right. In the heat of the moment, with adrenaline pumping, visibility reduced, you might only have a split second to decide whether or not to engage a target.
And those are the moments where mistakes can have devastating consequences, even with all the technology we have today designed to try and mitigate those risks. But there's another point Clausewitz makes that I find really interesting, almost counterintuitive at first. He suggests that in some scenarios, the defender in a night engagement might actually hold a slight advantage.
Really? That's not what you'd expect. You'd think the attacker, shrouded in darkness, able to dictate the terms of the engagement, would be the one with the upper hand. How does he justify that claim?
Well, he uses this very relatable analogy. Imagine yourself trying to navigate your own home in the dark.
Okay, I can see where you're going with this.
Right. You might not see perfectly, you might bump into a table leg or two, but you know the layout, the little quirks of your own space, the places where you need to step carefully. That inherent familiarity gives you an edge, even without perfect visibility.
So the defending force, especially if they've had time to familiarize themselves with the terrain, they have that home field advantage, so to speak.
Exactly. They know the hidden paths, the potential choke points, maybe even where they can use the darkness to set up an ambush. It's like playing hide and seek in a place, like the back of your hand.
Yeah.
They're practically invisible, at least to the untrained eye. It's such a fascinating advantage to think about, especially since, like you said, we usually associate the cover of darkness with giving the attacker the upper hand.
It really flips the script, doesn't it? And it highlights how warfare, both then and now, isn't just about brute force or technological superiority. It's about strategy. It's about intelligence. And it's about leveraging every single advantage you can get your hands on, including a deep, deep understanding of the battlefield. But this actually leads us to another crucial question that Clausewitz tackles. If night combat is so fraught with challenges, so inherently unpredictable, when does it actually make sense to engage in it? When are the risks, those very real risks we've been discussing, worth taking? Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, he was writing for military leaders, for people planning these kinds of operations, so he must have had some specific criteria in mind.
He did. He lays out several very specific scenarios where he believes a night attack is justified. And the first one, this might seem pretty obvious, is when you have a significant numerical advantage. Like when you know without a doubt that you have overwhelming force on your side and you can catch the enemy who's outnumbered completely off guard.
So it's about using the cover of darkness to maximize that element of surprise. You're hitting them with everything you've got before they can even process what's happening, let alone mount a counterattack.
Precisely. It's about speed, shock, and awe, all amplified by the disorientation of a night engagement. Now, another situation Clausewitz highlights is when the enemy is already in a vulnerable position, tactically or psychologically. Maybe they've just suffered heavy losses, their morale is low, their supply lines are stretched thin, or there are signs of disorganization within their ranks.
Well, they're already on shaky ground.
Exactly. A well-timed night attack in those circumstances. It's like throwing a match on a powder keg. You're exploiting their weakness, their already heightened anxiety, and turning that uncertainty, that fear, into full-blown panic.
It becomes as much a psychological tactic as a physical one. You're using the darkness to your advantage in a very deliberate way.
Absolutely. Now, he also talks about a much more desperate scenario, and that's the idea of using a night attack to break through an encirclement. So imagine your forces are surrounded, the enemy is closing in, and time is the one thing you don't have.
Not a good place to be.
Not at all. And in that situation, a daring, some might even say reckless, night attack, however risky, might be your only chance to punch a hole in their lines, to create an opening for your forces to escape.
It's a classic high-stakes gamble, relying on speed, surprise, and, let's be honest, a fair bit of luck.
Absolutely. And then finally, Clausewitz acknowledges that sometimes a night attack might be the only viable option left on the table, even if the odds aren't necessarily in your favor.
So it becomes a last resort, a desperate roll of the dice, when all other avenues have been exhausted.
Exactly. Imagine a situation where your forces are depleted, your resources are dwindling, and you need to create a diversion to buy precious time or to disrupt the enemy's plans just enough to give yourself some breathing room. It might not be pretty, but in those extreme circumstances, a night attack, even one with slim chances of success, could be enough to shift the momentum, however temporarily. But here's the thing, and this is critical to remember, Clausewitz was all about practicality. He understood that romanticizing warfare was a dangerous game, especially when it came to something as unpredictable and chaotic as a night battle.
And that perspective, that grounded, realistic view of the true costs of war, is something that's so important to keep in mind, especially as we move into discussing how technology, something Clausewitz could only have dreamed of, has impacted these calculations. I mean, we've come a long, long way since the days of muskets and bayonets.
Indeed we have. And yet, as you'll see, so many of the core principles Clausewitz identified, those fundamental truths about the nature of warfare, they still resonate even on a modern battlefield saturated with technology.
It's really mind-blowing when you think about it. Like, we've gone from hoping for a clear moonlit night to having all these crazy gadgets and sensors that can practically see in the pitch black.
Yeah.
It's like we're trying to cheat darkness itself.
Right. You'd think, with all our fancy tech, those old-school worries about the challenges of night combat would be a thing of the past. But here's the thing. The more you dig into it, the more you realize that so many of Clausewitz's core principles, those fundamental truths about strategy and conflict, they still apply just as much today as they did back then, maybe even more so.
So it's not just as simple as, well, now we can see better, so night fighting is no big deal.
Not at all. And take the whole issue of intelligence, for instance. Clausewitz, he was obsessed with this idea that getting a clear picture of what the enemy was up to at night was almost impossible. And today, sure, we've got satellites, we've got drones, we've got all these ways to gather information, but the battlefield itself, man, it's become exponentially more complex.
Oh, absolutely. We're not just talking about troop movements and artillery positions anymore. Now you've got cyber warfare, you've got electronic jamming, misinformation campaigns spreading like wildfire. It's like the intelligence game has leveled up in a way Clausewitz probably couldn't even imagine.
Exactly. You could have the most high-tech night vision goggles in the world, but if the intel feeding into those goggles is outdated, inaccurate, or straight up manipulated, well, those goggles aren't going to do a whole lot of good, are they?
It's like a constant back and forth, isn't it? As we develop these amazing tools to cut through the darkness, Our adversaries are coming up with even more sophisticated ways to distort and manipulate what we see.
It's a technological arms race for sure. But it really underscores why Clausewitz remains so relevant. He forces us to think beyond just the tools themselves and consider that broader strategic context. Always be asking, okay, what am I not seeing here? What's the other side of this equation?
So how does that apply to other aspects of night combat? What about the whole idea of surprise, for example? I mean, it seems like in a world with 247 surveillance, pulling off a truly surprising attack would be way harder than it was back in Clausewitz's day.
You'd think so, right? But then you look at modern special forces operations, and what do you see? They still rely heavily on stealth, on timing, on using the cover of darkness to infiltrate and disrupt. Those core principles are still very much in play, even in our hyper-connected world.
So that element of surprise, of emerging from the shadows when the enemy least expects it, that still has a real tactical advantage, even with all our fancy technology.
Absolutely. It speaks to something so fundamental about warfare, about human psychology even. There's a reason why we still tell ghost stories around a campfire, right? That fear of the unknown, of what we can't see lurking just beyond the edge of the light, it's primal. And on a battlefield, that primal fear can be a weapon just as powerful as any bullet or bomb.
Wow. So much to think about. As we wrap up here, is there one key takeaway, one big idea that you'd want our listener, especially someone navigating the complexities of the modern military world, to really take to heart from Clausewitz's writings on night combat?
I think more than anything, it's a call for clear-headed analysis even, or maybe especially, when you're dealing with something as inherently chaotic as a night battle. Just because you have access to all this amazing technology, all these tools that Clausewitz could only have dreamed of, doesn't mean you should automatically default to a night operation. Clausewitz, he was all about pragmatism. He'd be the first one to tell you, hey, step back, analyze the situation, weigh the risks, and ask yourself, can my objectives be achieved just as effectively or maybe even more effectively through a different approach? Don't be seduced by the allure of high-tech solutions if a simpler, more elegant solution is staring you right in the face.
It's about picking the right tool for the job, whether that's a daring night raid or a more measured approach.
Exactly. And always, always be prepared for the unexpected. Technology can fail. Intelligence can be flawed. And in those moments when the plan goes out the window and you're facing the unknown, it's your ability to adapt, to think critically, to fall back on those core principles that Clausewitz articulated so brilliantly. That's what will make the difference between success and failure.
That's a powerful message to end on. Don't be blinded by the gadgets, respect those enduring principles, and stay adaptable in the face of uncertainty. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us into Clausewitz's thoughts on night combat. We hope it gives our listener plenty to ponder as they continue their own exploration of military history and strategy. Until next time on The Deep Dive, thanks for listening.